When you declare a variable, its data type can either be a simple value or a complex object. Simple values include data types like those I showed in a previous video, including strings, booleans, and numeric values. Complex objects are instances of classes. In object-oriented terminology, a class is a definition of a bit of software, and when you create an instance of that class, it's called an object. In this demonstration, I'll show you how to declare an instance of a class or an object in both C# and in Visual Basic, and the particular type of object that I'll use is a date-time value. This is represented as the date-time class, and you use the same class in either language. I'll start with C#. I'll open the page programmingc#.aspx, and then I'll save it as object.c#.aspx. Then I'll place the cursor inside the Run button click function, and I'll first create an instance of the datetime class using the following syntax. I'll start with datetime, and then I'll assign the variable name as dt for datetime. When you instantiate or create an instance of a class, you use the new keyword. This new keyword is used in both Visual Basic and in C#. And then you call a function that has the same name as the class itself. This is known as the constructor method of the class. I'll use datetime, and I'll follow it with an opening and closing parenthesis. Now I'll output the value of the datetime object using my output function. The datetime object is a complex object. For most complex objects, if you want to turn it into a string, you call a function or a method of the class called toString. So I'll pass in dt.toString. I'll save the changes, and I'll run the page. I'll click Run Code, and I'll see the results. Notice that when you create a new instance of the datetime class, it automatically represents the first day of the first month of the first year at midnight. If you want this same object to represent the current date time, the syntax looks a little different. I'll close the browser and return back to the function code. Now I'll create another datetime object, once again setting the data type of datetime, and I'll call this one nowDT. The datetime class has a property called now. This is known as a static property. You refer to it as a member of the class definition itself, rather than as a property of an instance of the class. When you refer to a static property, it looks like this. And notice that the now property is displayed as an available member of the class. The now property is not a function, it's a property, and so you don't put the parentheses at the end. I'll call the output function again, and I'll pass in nowDT.toString. I'll save the changes and run the page again. I'll click Run Code, and you'll see that the first date time, which was instantiated using the new keyword, represents the default date time, the first month of the first year, and so on, whereas the version of the datetime object that's created from the now property represents the current date time, and you see the date and the time on which I recorded this video. Now I'll do the same thing in Visual Basic. I'll open the page programmingvb.aspx, and I'll save the file as object.vb.aspx. I'll place the cursor inside the Run button click function, and now I'll declare an instance of the datetime class using Visual Basic syntax. I'll start with dim, meaning that it's a variable that's local to the function. I'll put in the as operator, and this time, instead of using datetime, I use the Visual Basic version of this variable, which is simply date. Then the rest of the code looks pretty much the same as in Visual Basic. I'll use the keyword new, and then I'll use date as a method. Then I'll output the value of the DT object. In Visual Basic, you don't need the toString function, so I'll just output DT. And I'll run the page, click the Run Code button, and this time you only see the time. So now, if I'd like the same level of functionality as I had with C#, instead of using the Visual Basic date object, I'll use the underlying .NET Framework object, which in Visual Basic is known by its fully qualified prefix system.datetime. So I'll set that as the data type, and I'll call the appropriate constructor function. Then I'll go to the call to the output method, and I'll add dt.toString. I'll save the changes and run the page again, click the Run Code button, and now I'm seeing the same results as I did in C#. I'll follow the same pattern to get the current date and time. I'll type in dim dtNow as system.datetime, and once again I'll use the now property of the datetime class, system.datetime.now. And then I'll output the toString version of that object, dtNow.toString. I'll save my changes and run the page. And you'll see once again that I'm showing the date time on the server at the moment that I run the page. So that's a look at how to use the system.datetime class in either C# or Visual Basic. The .NET framework contains thousands of class definitions. Once you understand the basic syntax of working in ASP.NET, expanding your ASP.NET programming skills is largely a matter of learning about new classes and how they work in your programming language.